Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel again. Thank y'all so much for coming over, man. Hey, we are back on the Art of Dialogue channel, which I'll leave in the description for you guys to check out more and even subscribe. Gene Deal, y'all know he has been saying a lot for years. This right here, though, Gene Deal warns 50 Cent and explains how they may retaliate on him and says he's siding with 50 Cent. That is huge right there. For a person like Gene, who has been in this...
Stop scrolling, because this wasn't gossip, and it definitely wasn't random. When Gene Deal opened his mouth, it sounded less like commentary and more like an early warning siren, the kind that goes off before anyone admits there's smoke. His message was blunt. Eyes are shifting, pressure is building. And if you think 50 Cent is untouchable, you haven't been paying attention to how power really moves. This wasn't fear-mongering. This was pattern recognition. Gene didn't talk in hypotheticals, he talked in history. The same cycles, the same setups. The same slow creep from praise to pressure. 1 minute you're the loudest voice in the room. The next minute people start asking why you're too loud. And suddenly allies get quiet while narratives get rewritten. So why is Gene Deal backing 50 so hard? Because he knows what happens when someone refuses to play scared. When someone won't fold, won't apologize, won't suddenly disappear to make others comfortable. That's when the temperature rises. This isn't about one interview. It's about timing, it's about positioning, and it's about what happens when truth gets louder than protection. If you think this story is just starting, you're already late. It didn't come across like gossip or a hot take chasing clicks. When Gene Deal started speaking, the tone felt familiar to anyone who understands how power actually works behind the scenes. Calm, measured, almost tired. Like someone who's watched the same movie too many times and already knows how the third act usually plays out. He wasn't predicting chaos, he was recognizing a pattern. And patterns are dangerous because they don't rely on guesses. They rely on memory. Gene didn't frame it as paranoia. He framed it as timing. He pointed out how narratives shift quietly before they shift loudly. How the same industry that celebrates someone's fearlessness eventually grows uncomfortable with it. Especially when that person refuses to soften their voice, dilute their message, or ask permission to speak. That's when scrutiny replaces praise. And questions replace applause. And that's where 50 Cent enters the picture. Because 50 has never been subtle. He's never relied on whispers. He doesn't hedge statements or test the temperature before speaking. And historically, that kind of presence makes people nervous, not because it's wrong, but because it's uncontrollable. Gene's warning wasn't that someone was already coming for him. It was that the conditions were forming. The same conditions he's seen precede pressure campaigns, character assassinations, and quiet attempts to isolate someone socially before anything official ever happens. What made Gene's comments hit harder was his refusal to sensationalize them. No dramatic pauses. No doomsday language, just a steady explanation of how the game shifts when someone becomes too influential to ignore but too independent to manage. According to him, that's when the room changes. Conversations start happening without you in them. Motives get questioned retroactively. And suddenly, everything you've ever said gets reframed through a different lens. The internet didn't immediately explode. It leaned in. People started revisiting moments that once felt like isolated clashes and began seeing them as friction points. Times when 50 refused to back down. Times when he laughed off criticism instead of smoothing things over. Times when he stood by people others quietly distanced themselves from. Gene wasn't claiming guilt or innocence. He was pointing out how defiance alone can make someone a target in systems built on compliance. And that's why his warning didn't feel speculative. It felt procedural. Because in Gene's world, pressure doesn't start with accusations. It starts with discomfort, with the slow repositioning of narratives. with the suggestion that someone is too much, too reckless, or too outspoken. Once that seed is planted, everything else becomes easier to justify. What stood out most was Gene's emphasis on cycles. Not individuals. Not moments, cycles. He made it clear that this wasn't about one comment or one controversy. It was about accumulation, influence stacking on top of independence, visibility combined with refusal to play along. And historically, that combination has consequences by the end of his remarks. The message was clear. This wasn't a prediction of downfall. It was a warning about preparation, about awareness, about understanding that when the temperature shifts, it's rarely announced teats felt. Part 2, as people sat with what Gene said, the conversation began to evolve. Not into panic, but into recognition. Fans and observers alike started noticing how often stories follow the same arc. First comes praise. Then comes tolerance. Then comes discomfort. And finally, the question everyone pretends is neutral, but never is. Why does he think he can say that? That question changes everything. Because once someone's confidence becomes the issue, facts stop mattering as much as framing. Gene explained that this is usually when alliances grow quiet, not because people disagree, but because proximity starts to feel risky. And isolation doesn't require confrontation. It only requires hesitation. Missed calls, delayed responses, neutral statements where support used to be in that context. Gene backing 50 so openly mattered. He didn't hedge. He didn't say, let's wait and see. He made it clear that he recognizes the setup phase and refuses to pretend it's not happening. That kind of public support isn't common because it signals awareness. And awareness disrupts plans that rely on silence. What made the situation more intense was how calmly Gene spoke about it. There was no urgency in his voice. No fear, just experience. The kind that comes from watching powerful figures get chipped away not by one big hit, but by 1,000 small reframes. Suddenly, jokes get labeled as aggression. Confidence gets labeled as arrogance. Independence gets labeled as defiance. And once those labels stick, momentum does the rest. Online, people began debating whether this was overthinking or foresight. But even skeptics admitted one thing: the timing felt interesting. Not explosive, not dramatic, but interesting. And in narratives involving power, interesting is usually the first sign something is shifting behind the curtain. What Gene seemed to emphasize most was that backing 50 wasn't about blind loyalty. It was about precedent, about refusing to act surprised later when the tone changes and everyone pretends they didn't see it coming. He framed his support as preventative, not reactive. As someone standing up before pressure forces choices, that distinction matters. Because once a narrative hardens, support becomes risky. Before that, it's just honesty. As the discussion spread, people started reinterpreting silence from others, not as disagreement, but as caution. And caution is contagious. It's how rooms empty without anyone walking out. It's how influence gets challenged without a single official move being made by this point. The story wasn't about whether someone will come for 50. It was about whether the environment is being conditioned to accept it if they do. And that's the phase Gene Deal was sounding the alarm about, not the strike, but the setup. The most unsettling part wasn't threat. It was normalization. Because once people accept the idea that pressure is justified, the outcome almost stops mattering. The process becomes invisible. And when processes turn invisible, they become very effective. Gene's warning wasn't dramatic. It was strategic. And that's why it lingered. As Gene Deal's warning settled in, the conversation didn't blow up the way most online controversies do. Instead, it slowed down, and that slowdown was telling. People weren't rushing to argue him. They were thinking. And when the internet starts thinking instead of reacting, it usually means something touched a nerve that feels uncomfortably familiar. Gene wasn't offering a conspiracy. He was offering context. The kind that forces people to look backward before they can look forward. What many picked up on immediately. was how deliberate his framing was. He didn't accuse anyone by name. He didn't claim an attack was already underway. He spoke about conditions, about environments that quietly change long before pressure becomes visible. According to Gene, this is how things usually start, not with sirens, but with subtle shifts in tone. Praise cools. Invitations slow. Narratives soften and then harden in different directions. And by the time anyone realizes what's happening, the story has already been rewritten. That's why his support for 50 Cent felt significant. Backing someone before anything happens is risky. It signals awareness, and awareness interferes with setups that rely on surprise and isolation. Gene made it clear that he wasn't reacting to headlines, he was reacting to a pattern he's seen before. In his world, influence plus independence is rarely celebrated for long. Eventually, it becomes inconvenient. And inconvenient people don't get confronted head-on. They get reframed, that the reframing stage is where everything changes. Gene described how language slowly shifts. Confidence becomes arrogance. Humor becomes aggression. Honesty becomes recklessness. The same traits that once made someone untouchable suddenly get recoded as reasons they're a problem. And once that recoding happens, distance feels justified. Silence feels responsible. People who once laughed loudly beside you start speaking carefully around you. That's when pressure stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like consensus. Online. This explanation resonated more than people expected. Fans began pointing out moments when 50's outspokenness was applauded one week and criticized the next. Not because his behavior changed, but because the tolerance for it did. Gene wasn't saying this shift had reached its peak. He was saying the early signs were there. Its peak. He was saying the early signs were there. And early signs are easy to ignore until it's too late. What made Gene's warning even heavier was his refusal to dramatize it. He didn't present himself as a savior or a whistleblower. He spoke like someone who has watched enough cycles to know how they unfold. That calm delivery made his message harder to dismiss. Panic can be argued with. Experience is harder to refute. As discussions spread, people began noticing something else: the quietness of others who might normally speak up. Not opposition, absence. And absence often says more than criticism. Gene hinted at this without calling anyone out directly. He talked about how hesitation spreads in powerful spaces, how people wait to see which way the wind blows before committing to a stance, and how that waiting creates the illusion of agreement, even when none has been expressed in that context. Gene's loyalty mattered, not because it changed outcomes, but because it disrupted the usual script. Support is expected after controversy, when sides are already chosen. Support before anything breaks challenges the idea that pressure is inevitable. It reminds people that narratives don't have to be accepted just because they're forming the internet. Predictably split into camps. Some argued Gene was reading too much into normal industry behavior. Others said that was exactly the point. Normal behavior is how pressure gets normalized. Rarely does anyone wake up to chaos overnight. It arrives through routine, through habits, through small adjustments no one questions until they stack up. What Gene emphasized most was preparedness, not paranoia. Preparedness. He framed his warning as a call to awareness, not fear. Know the room. Read the temperature. Understand when conversations about you start happening without you present. Because once you're reacting to the narrative, you're already behind it. The goal is to recognize the shift early enough to stay grounded when it accelerates. That message hit especially hard because of who 50 Cent is. Someone who has built an entire public persona around refusing to be controlled, around saying what others won't, around surviving attempts to silence him, both literal and reputational. Gene wasn't questioning 50's strength. He was acknowledging that strength is often what invites scrutiny in the first place. As more people sat with the idea, the focus moved away from, are they coming for him? And toward, would anyone be surprised if they did? That's the real metric of success in a setup. Not whether an attack happens, but whether people are already conditioned to accept it as reasonable if it does. And conditioning doesn't look dramatic. It looks like jokes. Turning into critiques. It looks like distance disguised as professionalism. It looks like people saying, I don't know the full story, but by the end of the discussion cycle, Gene's message had accomplished something subtle but powerful. It didn't convince everyone. It didn't need to. It planted awareness. It reminded people that influence is never just about power. It's about tolerance. And tolerance shifts quietly. The warning wasn't that something will happen. It was that if it does, it won't be sudden. And those are the situations you survive not by reacting, but by seeing them early. By the time Gene Deal's warning fully circulated, the conversation had moved past if pressure could come and landed squarely on how it usually arrives. Not with a headline, not with a raid, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a shift in tone so subtle that most people don't notice it until they're already standing in a different room. That was the core of Gene's message and why it lingered. He wasn't predicting an event. He was describing a process. In that process, the most dangerous moment isn't the attack it's the normalization that comes before it. Gene made it clear that the real risk for someone like 50 Cent isn't opposition. Opposition is loud and obvious. The real risk is reinterpretation, the slow transformation of a public image without changing a single behavior. One day you're outspoken, the next day you're problematic. One day you're fearless, the next day you're reckless. The person hasn't moved, but the lens has. And once the lens shifts, everything you do starts looking different. That's where Gene's experience mattered. He wasn't talking about theory. He was talking about repetition. He described how systems don't usually silence people by force, they exhaust them through framing, through constant reevaluation, through this steady drip of doubt. Suddenly, defending yourself feels unnecessary until it feels impossible. And by then, the story has already solidified. What Gene emphasized was that this phase often feels deceptively calm. No public fallout. No clear enemy. Just subtle distancing. Invitations dry up. Conversations feel shorter. Support becomes quieter. And none of it looks hostile on paper. That's why it works. Because when pressure finally becomes visible, people can say, this didn't come out of nowhere. They can point backward and justify it retroactively. That's the trap. And Gene's reason for backing 50 publicly was to interrupt that trap early. Public support changes dynamics. It reminds people that narratives are being watched, not just consumed. It signals that someone understands the mechanics at play and refuses to act surprised later. Gene wasn't claiming to protect 50 from consequences. He was refusing to let reframing happen uncontested. There's a difference. The conversation online began reflecting that understanding. People weren't asking whether 50 had enemies. He always has. They were asking whether the environment was being conditioned to accept pressure against him as reasonable. That's the real test. Because when people are already primed to believe scrutiny is justified, resistance disappears before it's needed. Gene also touched on something uncomfortable. Success doesn't shield you from this process. Accelerates it. Influence without permission is unsettling. Someone who doesn't need approval can't be managed through incentives or access. That makes institutions nervous. And when institutions get nervous, they don't rush. They observe. They wait for moments they can use. For statements they can reframe. For jokes they can reinterpret. For confidence they can call arrogance. In that sense, Gene wasn't worried about 50 being weak. He was worried about the environment pretending strength is the problem. As this idea spread, people began to recognize familiar patterns from past figures who experienced similar shifts. Not because they were identical, but because the arc felt recognizable. Praise turning to tolerance. Tolerance turning to scrutiny. Scrutiny turning to justification. Gene wasn't saying the ending was fixed. He was saying the path was familiar, and familiarity breeds complacency. That's why Gene kept returning to awareness. Not fear, awareness. Knowing when the conversation about you changes. Knowing when silence around you feels different. Knowing when support becomes conditional instead of automatic. These aren't signs of defeat, but they are signals. And ignoring signals doesn't make them go away. What made Gene's warning resonate was its restraint. He didn't escalate. He didn't dramatize. He didn't call for sides to be chosen. He simply refused to pretend the room hadn't shifted. That refusal alone disrupted the narrative flow, because it reminded people that what feels natural is often engineered through repetition and patience by this point. The story wasn't about a specific threat. It was about vigilance. People began to understand that the most effective pressure doesn't announce itself. It blends in. It hides behind professionalism, behind concern, behind just asking questions. And once those questions start circulating widely enough, answers stop mattering. Gene's backing of 50 functioned as a pause button. Not a shield, but a spotlight. A way of saying, pay attention to how this is being framed. And that's powerful, because framing only works when it goes unnoticed. In the end, the warning wasn't about taking sides. It was about refusing to be passive. Gene Deal wasn't predicting a fall. He was challenging the audience not to accept one as inevitable. He was reminding people that narratives don't become true because they're accurate. They become true because they're repeated without resistance. And once repetition takes over, reality spends a long time playing catch-up. That's why the alarm mattered. Before you go, remember the name Fame Blue. This is where fame gets decoded, not hyped. Where the noise fades and the real signals turn blue. We don't chase headlines after they break. We read the pressure before it hits. If you want insight instead of chaos, context instead of clout, you're in the right place. Fame Blue watches the shifts others miss, breaks down the power moves behind the scenes, and tells you what matters before everyone else catches on. Like this, if you're done with surface-level drama. Comment if you felt the temperature change. And subscribe now, because when fame turns blue, only the ones paying attention understand why. Fame Blue isn't late. It isn't loud. It's early. Late. It isn't loud. It's early.